Welcome to Creating Better Products, where we explore the real-world stories from product leaders. Not just their successes, but also their failures and lessons learned. You will get practical tips that you can apply tomorrow. I'm your host, Sabrina Mach. I have almost 2 decades of experience, and I love learning from others. This is why my mission is to share the stories of amazing product and design professionals with you and the world. Today, my guest is Jacob Tiedemann. Jacob is a product leader who originally started as a software developer. And in the past 5 years, Jacob spent passionately bringing product thinking to technical landscapes and platforms. And you will not be surprised to hear that Jacob is dedicated to crafting impactful products. That's why he's here. But he's also dedicated to crafting those empowered teams behind the products. Jacob, you are based in Hamburg, Germany, and your recent life-changing or fun fact, or maybe both, is that recently you became a dad. And I think with these news, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sabrina, for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and luckily my daughter has given me 8 hours of sleep today, so I'm full of energy. Looking really forward to talk to you about developer experience, right?
Yes. So thank you for introducing the topic. That is also one that's very dear to my heart and maybe sometimes overlooked. So I'm curious, Jacob, how did you get into the topic yourself, and what has made you over the years into an expert in this topic?
Yeah, you've already mentioned, right? I started my career as a software developer, so I have a technical background, and I moved careers then to more like a business analyst role, some agile coaching, some consulting, and now being a product manager and leader. And having this technical badge that you always wear, I've always been drawn to technical challenges and platforms. So whether it's building products on top of IoT platforms or building software that goes onto cars. So anything that was a little bit more technically challenging in terms of maybe sometimes hardware, but maybe even sometimes the users or the product itself was more a technical one that maybe is not end consumer facing. So, and I've worked as a consultant before, and back in the days, it must have been 7 years ago, something around that time, the DevOps movement was really getting traction. So I also was getting into that. And I think at that point in time, DevOps already promoted developer experience, but nobody called it at that point in time like that. They already promoted a people-centric approach, like looking at the developers, what their jobs are, how to do things. But somehow it got lost in the next 7 years, and it was more focused on software delivery processes or our metrics and more like value stream mapping. So the process part is again going up a little bit in the front. I believe like the first time I actually got in touch with the concept of developer experience must have been in 2019, around that time. A former colleague of mine, Tanya, and I both handed in a conference talk for adopting new customer journeys for developer platforms. We both were working on separate projects, building like a cloud platform, and I was more building like a hardware platform for cars. And we both handed in the talk, but we didn't know about each other. Like we've met and talked before. Luckily, the conference organizers were so nice to connect us both and said like, hey, you both handed in a similar talk about things. So why don't you want to speak together about developer experience? And we're like, developer experience, that's the thing. And I think from then on, we really digged into that topic, found a few more, passionate people who tried bringing product thinking, user experience concepts and practices into the realm of technical products and platforms. And that's how I got in there. And it's quite fun and quite challenging to adopt these practices in the context of technical platforms. And in the end, it's all about still solving critical business challenges and still delighting users in the end. And that's what's keep us going as product people, right? Like that's what we're here for.
Yeah, that's definitely dear to my heart. And Jacob, you've worked on many different engagements now and in many different contexts, bringing developer experience into organizations. And you mentioned you spoke at conferences, you've also written articles. And I'm curious, why is it so important that we do speak about developer experience and make that top of mind for organizations?
Yeah, I think there are two sides to it. The most important thing is, from my experience and a lot of other practitioners, if you look at platforms, especially if there are internal platforms of medium, larger enterprises, Most of the decision making to build this platform is either driven by a business need, a business capability that is needed. For example, we need to scale, so we're doing now a cloud migration, or we need a cloud platform, or there's some technical interestingness. So from a tech strategy or tech vision perspective, there's like Kubernetes coming up. That's the hot trendy topic or the hot trendy technology to use. So there's a drive to adopt it, which is great in both terms, right? Like having a business need or having like new technology that enables you to be innovative. That's great. But there's an imbalance in this decision making, because what always falls short is the user. Nobody's asking or looking at the developers who will be actually using those platforms or those technical products or tools that you put in place, if it's fitting for their job, if it's actually helpful the way that it's being built. And the tricky thing about it, why this is so important to talk about, and most of us know those things, that you should be user-centric, like everybody has heard about that, works kind of like agile. But tech folks usually build for tech folks, right? As a developer, I'm building a platform for developers. And often in those companies, there's a fallacy that everybody falls into. I've been recently working in this company for the past 7 years as a developer. I know what developers at my company need. And just on a recent client, I've seen this again. We don't need to talk to anybody else. I already know I'm the expert. I'm part of the customer group. And I mean, we all know that if you think yourself you're about the customer, you're on the wood way, right? Like that's the wrong direction you're going to. Yeah.
And that's fascinating. You touched on two things there that I would love to dig in deeper. One is how things around developer experience usually start with the technology lens or the business need, which is good to have them. And then the second thing I'd love to dive into deeper is I'm a representative of the user. So maybe we start on the first one. How does that journey for and thinking about developer experience usually start? Does it start in that ideal way where organizations say we want to create a better experience for developers? Or does it really always start with the business or the technology need? But then how do you take stakeholders on that journey to look beyond the thing that ignited that thought that they want to do something in that space?
That's a really good question. Usually, like in most of the cases, it started out with something different. Like we are building a cloud platform, or we are trying to build some tools for security that helps the development teams to be more compliant. And at one point in time, those teams who build these products figure out like nobody likes to adopt, or nobody's really using it, and we don't get the traction. And it's quite easy to get some funding in a company to build something new that has some business case behind it, but to kind of like keep continuing, and you want to have a stable product team that can throughout the years improve the product, you need to show some traction and some extra value that you realize, because value only results from use. If nobody's using it, there's no value in it. And that's mostly the point where I've seen that people are looking to develop experience. For example, I recently talked to one of my clients, and they reached out because they have been developing a platform that helps with a transformation from an old architecture to a new one. Don't need to go into the details there, but they reached out and said like, hey, we figured out like only 10, 15% of the user base of the developers is adopting our platform and the others aren't. So we ran a survey and asked them why that is so, and only 5% of the user base responded. So, which was in total, I think, like 14 people or something. That's like nothing. If you ever conducted user research, you can build a quantitative analysis on. So that's where you get into it, right? Like you come across this challenge, you have this gap of adoption that is usually in there, or people getting very unsatisfied. And the worst dysfunction that usually happens, that I think most of us have seen, is then it's mandated to use that platform. Everybody's forced to use that platform. And I mean, that is one of the worst things, to force people to do something, because they will find workarounds, they will find ways to not fully use it. And I've seen that, right? New cloud platform, great concept, great features in there, but was not quite fitting the way of working of the team. So they only used it to get their AWS accounts and didn't use any kind of other feature and service of that platform, and then did everything on their own in the AWS console, right? And that's where it's kind of like bells around. But recently, I've seen a trend of more people trying to start with developer experience, which is personally quite intriguing, as you said, because you're starting, right, like with a problem in mind and not the solution in mind. And that's really interesting, that before trying to go on something, and usually it's some change that happens in an organization, doing a transformation. Maybe the end consumer facing product teams already shifted into a new way of working, more customer centric, more value stream aligned. And I'm talking about a specific company I have in mind there, an automotive company I've worked with. And the central IT department was kind of like becoming the blocker. Everybody was faster, more customer centric, but they have been staying behind. So they kind of like lost the goodwill of the organization for what they've been providing. And they said like, okay, then we will also transform to be more customer centric and more value stream aligned. So looking at the development teams. And for that, they obviously, like DevOps promotes, try to do a value stream mapping, try to do domain driven design, who are our user bases, who are the domains we need to support. But they also said like, we would like to talk to the developers. And they really put themselves out there and said like, we will conduct user research before we make any kind of decision how we do our transformation, how we structure our teams, and what even the products will be or platforms that we will invest in. And that's a really nice trend to see, because this drastically also reduces the risk of going into the mandatory forced platform direction, right?
Yeah. And coming back to one of the other things that you raised earlier around, I'm the representative of developers because I'm a developer. How do you tackle that? Because if you start with user research, I can imagine possibly some pushback from the person who feels that they are a good representative of the target group.
Yeah, and that's one of the key challenges that is always there. Even if you would be, I don't know, working with a founder who has a cool product idea, they would also advocate a lot for their ideas because they have probably some expertise in that domain and came up with that idea based on past data they gathered in their head, right? Like not written down. So there's obviously anything that those folks have as ideas. It's not necessarily that they're wrong. It's just about reducing risks. Like in terms of your idea might be the right one, but let's be sure before we implement it and waste a lot of efforts maybe in that direction. And that's the conversation I usually try to take. Are we fine with the risk we are taking here? Like, is the investment huge or is it revertible easily if we are going in the wrong direction? And how do we check things? And that's usually a conversation I have with people. And most people have, if you dig down and talk to them about them, as you are asking me, like, was there a point in time where you maybe had a setback, where something didn't work out? And if you get those people to think about those failures in the end, they're like, yeah, I had something. And I personally also have one of those things, right? And when I was still a developer, I was tasked to containerize applications and build the pipelines new so the containers are being deployed. Docker at that time was coming up and it was kind of like trendy. So I was sitting down and was just doing that task. I was doing it how I liked and how I think it's the best way to do it. It worked. The applications were containerized. We had new pipelines that were running, but all developers in my team, the other ones, they didn't get it. I've explained it to them. They said like, cool, but what now if I need to change the configuration, or what if I need to do this or that? And I was like, I'm getting tedious of all those questions. I'm now running a training. So I ran a training with my team to explain to them how those things work. Then I need to write more documentation and so on. And in the end, right, like thinking now about that, it's like, yeah, I miss talking to the actual users of that, and also didn't build in any kind of like guidance into the concept that I had, right? So it was like I needed to add new services on top. And we all know that services that depend on people are not scalable and also not long living. So it's easy to fall into that trap, right? Like it's really, really easy because sometimes it's a small thing, but again, it can be wasted effort in the end.
Yes, and through your questioning of the individuals involved who feel like they're the representative user, are you able to trigger similar stories that they remember? Do you share your story to empathize with them?
Yeah, it's sometimes you have like, depending on the people you're talking to, they kind of are quite like thinking about and have a lot of experience in the company and are eager to tell about what worked and didn't work, right? Like, but yeah, exactly. Sharing our stories, my stories, also gives some inspiration in those regards. But also what sometimes helps is just because there are always developers around you, you don't need to start a whole user research. Just talk to a few and then come back to that stakeholder or the person you're collaborating with on developer experience and say like, hey, I've just talked to, I don't know, Raul, Max, and Catherine, and they all are pointing in that direction. should we check that out, right? And then you have those conversations. But yet again, you can't convince all people.
Yeah, and thinking back to the research that you mentioned around developers that can start really small, just talking to 3 people around, I'm really curious, how easy is it to do user research with developers?
You would think it's quite easy, right? If you've done user research, if you read user research and you know what to do, you set up some interviews, you write an interview script, and then you go talk to them. You might run a survey or something, or do some observe on the job session. Sounds quite easy, but if you really think about it, this is quite challenging. I mean, I myself had the same thing when I talked about the automotive platform. Adopting those things, just a customer journey for developers. It's a specific domain. We could treat development and developers as a specific user group and a domain, and you can get into any domain as a product person or designer or something to learn about that domain. But each domain has some specifics. And if you look at examples for user research, you will find examples a lot for e-commerce, user journeys for e-commerce, retail, or banking even right at the moment. But if you look for developer journeys, or you look how to do research and interviews with developers, you find very little artifacts. So the challenge that you have is you need to translate from e-commerce to the very technical domain of cloud platforms, for example. And then you look at like when you interview users for an e-commerce platform, you're asking about how the checkout process was, if they found the product they were looking for, and so on. And what do you ask about a cloud platform? And that's why it's hard. Translating from one practice to the other one. And there are not many examples out there at the moment. They're growing and growing. There are more coming out that, but that's also the thing why we, after running a whole bunch of user research, we developed our own playbook that we can pull from to say, like, what's the object we are researching, and really scoping the thing. What are the aspects, the lenses we want to take on the developer experience? Are we more looking at specific phases of the development lifecycle, like coding or deploying, that we look at? Or is it more in terms of like the actual single role of a developer, what jobs they have, what the cognitive load of a single developer is, like what they all have to have in mind in the same time? Or even looking at more kind of like a platform level and say, like, we researching the user base of a platform. And if you research a user base of a platform, you first need to understand what is this platform about and offering. And at the same time, you need to understand what are the jobs of the developers that they have to use the platform for. So that's quite the tricky thing. So, and I totally get if anybody who wants to adopt product thinking and user-centric design practices for technical platforms, that if you have not a lot of experience in it, and you can pull from past experiences, and you might be, I don't know, a tech lead now being product manager, platform manager, which is quite a natural growth path for somebody. That's hard. And that's where it really comes in to look for peers and talk to others to do those things. And one interesting thing to just point out a misconception here is if you start transferring that, you will find a lot of things about employee experience. You won't find something about developers, but employee experience. So how satisfied are you with your job or your pay or your growth and learning path and budget and offerings that you have? And it's quite easy to say like, oh, then we will research that and go in terms of developer satisfaction, we go more into employee satisfaction. If you touch on that topic and you don't outscope that, you easily go in the direction of researching things that you can't control or influence. If you're just an engineering manager, platform manager, maybe the head of the department, you can't change how jobs are being described, or you can't easily change the pay of people. You can't change the training catalog that easy. So that's also, you need to draw the lines of what can you influence and control. So you can start out in a team. If you are developing a team or tech lead of a team, you have very much control about how the developer experience in your team is. You might not be able to change all the things, but then again, you might be able to influence some of the platforms because you're users and you could give feedback to the platforms you're using, right?
I think that's a really interesting guardrail to keep in mind. Don't go too much in areas that you can't control or can't influence, but really starting with the areas that are within your realm of influence. So you touched on really interesting points: developer experience versus user experience versus employee experience. And maybe they're not that contrasted as I make that right now, but where do you see where they have really strong commonalities, and where are the areas where you say, here it's really different, where you need to pay attention?
Yeah. I mean, if I could draw a Venn diagram right now, I would be drawing a Venn diagram. But developer experience and employee experience have an overlap. Every developer is an employee, so there's an overlap in that, but not every employee is a developer. And just to give an example, the hardware you're working on, our laptops, they're usually issued to every employee. So, and where we come into the developer experience bit, if every employee, including developers, gets the same laptop, the developer experience might be crappy because you don't get the hardware that has the requirements to do your job, missing RAM, missing space on the hard drive, whatever it is, right? So this is where you then have an overlap. The employee experience could improve the developer experience by having a special offer for developers that they can select the laptop right for their job to be done, right? Like if I'm a data engineer, I get a laptop that is probably more high performing than, I don't know, a normal employee or a Java developer or something like that. So you can really also optimize the employee experience for developers. So that's the overlap I would describe there. And for user experience and developer experience, like developer experience is a part of user experience. It's just a very specific domain. Anything that you read and know about user experience, you can apply or is also in developer experience. There's very little that you can't do in developer experience that you would do in user experience. And I couldn't think of an example right now, so I would say like there's nothing. Any listener can call me and say like there's something and prove me wrong, but I right now would just be very bold and say like developer experience is fully part of user experience. And it's just very special in terms of, and I want to point out some things that make it a little bit special, that make it sometimes even easier and sometimes harder. Just for example, doing user research for an end consumer product can be quite hard because you need to find users. They are out there in the market. I mean, yes, you can go onto the street, but if we really want to have like a good amount of specific target user groups and having, I don't know, 5 people of at least each group you want to research, that's quite the effort. I mean, there are companies and software services that help you get those users and those interviews. So that's hard in user experience. In developer experience, it's usually quite simple. You just open Teams or Google Chat and write the developer in your company. You can easily find developers around you. You can easily talk to them. You can just put something in their calendar to speak to them. You could even if people are in the offices, you could just go to the table and talk to them or watch how they're doing things. So that's really, really easy to do. In some companies, it's hard. I made the experience in one company that to talk to a developer, I always had to speak first to the engineering manager. They wanted to know what I want to talk to the developer about. Then I had to speak to the product owner who wanted to check if it's valuable to invest the time of the developer. So really like stage gating the access to a developer. And then I was allowed to speak to a developer. So I did not do one interview to talk to a developer. I did 3 interviews kind of like to talk to a single developer. So there are some obstacles that are from a organization, political perspective that could come in the way. Then again, pointing out another difference, developers, their job is to analyze problems and find solutions for it. That's their job. That's what they're doing all day long. So not like you go onto the street and talk to a random person, ask like, hey, how are you doing your online shopping? And they explain it to you. They're no expert in how to improve online shopping. A developer is an expert in how to improve a software solution. So if you go to them and try to talk to them and try to talk about problems, they usually don't only tell you about the problem, but also the solutions they've tried, the solutions they've built on their own and are still using, and maybe solution ideas that they have to solve for the overall company. We all know that we also want first to be sure about the problem before we go into the solution space. This gets sometimes really mixed up. On the downside, it's hard to differentiate and you need to do a lot of like extrapolating from the solution they say to come back to the problem. On the other hand, they also know what they're speaking about. So sometimes you just talk to a developer and that person has a really great idea. Or they already have built a small script or solution that you say like, can I take your script, put this in my platform and make that available to everyone? And we actually had this on one of the platform I worked with. We had a new API that we rolled out and one team was not adopting the new version of the API. They were still using the old one. We're like, the new one is so much better. Like it has the new functionality, the new parameters that everybody was asking about. Why not? We went talking to them. And this is like tracking. We tracked API calls as we were doing user analytics. That's the same thing there. And we went to the team, talked to them, and they said like, yeah, your new API is great, but we've built like this whole pipeline step to automate things on your old pipeline, and it's working, and we have even more functionality that you do have in your new API version. And we're like, yeah, that makes sense why you're not switching. Because like usually you want to deprecate the old version at one point in time to reduce the amount of features that you need to maintain. So we exactly talked to the team, said, can we get your pipeline step and script and put that in pipeline in the API version and make that available to everyone? So there are things to learn. Then again, they had the right mind for the solution. We didn't need to come up with a solution. We just needed to extract it. And that's also a good pattern to follow if you want to do an improved developer experience. Go to the team, see how they are solving specific problems, see if other teams also have problems. And if yes, take a good practice of a team, extract it, scale it, make it available to the others. And then you have a quite easy job compared to user experience for other domains.
And in a way, when you extract it and apply it to the other team, you're also doing user research validation again, because you can see whether that team will adopt it. And if they do, great, you've got something that adds value. If not, you probably have to go back to the drawing board and find out what's that barrier. What is one thing that really surprised you in your journey that you didn't expect as a positive thing, but also what surprised you in a negative way, something that went wrong, and how did you handle that?
Yeah, let's start with the more positive thing, because the more negative one of the failure is even quite funny. So a very positive thing. The one thing that surprised me in the last developer experience research I did for a company, and they were looking for a new strategic direction. So really like trying to make decision based on that. And they wanted to improve the ease of development and the developer satisfaction. Those were the kind of like measures of success they wanted to look at. And when we started talking to the developers, we jumped into a call with them and we had smiling, even crying faces. I'm being very polarizing here, but it's so good that you're talking to us and thanks for asking. Nobody asked us before about feedback or doing something. So by just talking to the developers and introducing this feedback loop higher up, we already improved the developer satisfaction. And that's an amazing thing. By doing the research, you're already helping people because they have a feedback channel. They have a means to express what they need or what they feel. Even if we don't change it, it already helped a little bit to express something. Sometimes we just need to talk about things to make them better, to accept how they are or to feel acknowledged by that. So that's a really positive thing. That was like, I was so amazed by the last research. It was, on the other hand, it's maybe also a little bit sad that nobody talked to them before, but it's, from my perspective, very positive. And I even would call it a failure, the other example. I talked about this hardware development kit that we put on the tables of developers that develop software for cars like firmware and flashware. And at one point in time, we scaled this platform so large that we were moving into a critical phase where we were close going to operationalized, really replacing existing processes in the organization or switching our technology against the old one and so on. And this is obviously a critical point, and a lot of management attention came to the project. And because budget needs to be distributed, things need to be focused. We were sitting in a boardroom with all the senior executives, VPs, and so on. And we were going through all the different products we had in the portfolio of that platform and the different kind of features, because they're configuration management, fleet management, and so on. And we had this hardware development kit, which was for a very specific phase of the development, a quite useful, proven, viable thing for developers. And it's already been in use by some early adopters. So we came to this point in time where we're going through this thing, and a discussion came up of like, do we actually need it, right? And we argued from a user point of view, it's already being used. We already got traction. They looked at the team size the team was working on and how much it costs. And it cost a lot because it was hardware involved. You needed to prototype hardware and build hardware. And at the same time, you needed to build software to put it then on table. And every developer needed a piece of hardware that he needed to buy. It was not like super expensive in terms of the single hardware unit, but if you scale it to all those 6,000 plus developers of that company in the end, it's quite the amount. So they looked at it and said like, let's stop that. Let's rather focus this money on the fleet management or the configuration or data management to extract data from the car, which from a business perspective, you can see why you want to make that decision. But I think my face dropped. I was speechless, and we were like, but it's in use. It's producing value for the company. Well, that was a big learning. It was canceled. I mean, they didn't fall in a sunken cost fallacy on a positive note, but that was the learning where I was when looking at developer experience. It's not about only being user-centric. Coming back to the start of our conversation, it's also about the business need. And we missed out to articulate the business value well. We did not do our due diligence there, and we missed that part. And that's one key learning I took away from that I'm now trying to do in every engagement platform I'm working on, to make sure that we balance those two. So looking at the corporate strategy as you're doing user interviews at the same time and trying to connect those. I don't want to be sitting in that room again and throw my product away because it's expensive.
And beyond making sure that you connect the business, the user research and the developer experience to the business strategy and business goals, how do you measure the value of developer experience? How do you make that case now that you have that mark on your soul from the product being discontinued? How do you do that today?
I mean, articulating user value in terms of developer experience, we can look at the same things we would be doing for other users. It's adoption rates, retention rates, satisfaction, if it's NPS or some other form of how you want to measure satisfaction. You can measure the user value quite easy. And I think it's also quite easy to adopt classical user analytics, user metrics to developer experience. As I said, you might not be able to do user tracking analytics because you don't have a graphical user interface, but you have an API, so you can track API calls and which users are calling which API calls. And you can even put in some trackers in there to see what the journey is like. It's possible. So you can easily do that. For articulating the business value, this is more challenging because it depends totally on the organization, what kind of breakdown of corporate strategy to IT tech strategy and goals is existing. If you have very little to tie to, it's really hard to make a business case for what you're doing. And you need to make a lot of leap of faith, like bets. You need to say as a company in the future, we want to grow and our industry is changing. For example, let's take the energy market. We are moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy. That's a shift. And because we're seeing that shift, we know that we need to be in the future innovative with our tech because we need to change a lot of our tech and maybe scale things. So my platform is paving the way to be capable in the future to do that. And that's a kind of a very logical plan that you lay out there where you need to make some assumptions and some hypotheses. Which if you don't have concrete business goals you can map to, is also hard to back up. So it's more a story that you then tell, and you can back this up with some research or some technical feasibility and assessment to say, okay, right now we're being blocked or we're not capable to scale if that was happen. And then you can argue for the business value. But if you have more information or more things to anchor to, like tech strategies and business strategies, you can look for financial value. It's quite easy to say, if we remove following friction or problems for developers, we also will, for example, reduce the time that developers spend on non-value adding tasks. And non-value adding tasks are usually anything that is not directly in the critical path of delivering software. It's not only coding. There's also a misconception. Value-adding tasks for developers is not only coding. There's also planning, ideation, deployment, monitoring, operation. There's a whole bunch more value-adding tasks to things, just to say that here. But reducing the time for non-value-adding tasks, it's not necessarily reducing costs for the organization in terms of I'm saving money on that, but you are increasing operational efficiency. And operational value is also a business value that you can tie to. So productivity, operational value, performance, or even profitability. If you look more into the financial value direction, you can do that. It's not often the case that you increase revenue with developer experience. There's one exception. A lot of companies having a great developer experience are SaaS companies that have one of the major user groups there are developers. And if we look at that, there would be, for example, Stripe, payment provider. There's a business capability that you're buying with that, but most of the things that I need to work with are developers need to integrate Stripe into the product and the tools. So you need to integrate a lot of APIs, you need to set up a lot of testing environments and connect your test environments and data with the other ones. And they have a great developer experience. So obviously the buyer persona is the business, but the actual main user is a developer, and they have a great experience doing that. They have great documentation, they have good portals. AWS, for example, is another example of a platform that is developer focused and has a great developer experience. In some ways not. So it's also externally focusing. And in those cases, you can also think about increasing revenue. For example, if you open up a platform, and we did this at one company where we built an IoT platform, we built some products on top of it. One company was not interested, one customer wasn't interested in the platforms on top. They just want to have the data. So we just exposed a data API for them to consume the data and put into their reporting and fleet management tools. And we let them pay per use. So we increased revenue of that company in those regards by just opening up an API. So it's possible to have financial value. But then again, we can also look at employee value. If you have more satisfied employees, you might increase attracting or retaining talent, which is right now in the market a very tough thing to do. So if you can do something to keep your happy developers, then that's also value for the business. So you can measure financial value in terms of maybe profitability, maybe cost savings. If you do something, more likely you will be focusing operational value, efficiency in those regards. Employee value is obviously a thing that goes very well with developer experience hand in hand. So those are things you can be looking at. And one thing to point out, because most technical platforms are being built part of a transformation, there's value in innovation. If you support a transformation or innovation and you're not doing the innovation or transformation yourself, but you're enabling it somehow, or you're aligning with the mission or the strategy, you're supporting something, and you can argue as well as this is value. And most of the things you can measure somehow. If it's contributing to set goals, if it's alignment to something, or if it's even not data that you can gather of like 3,000 developers are wasting 1 hour per month on administrative tasks, we can get rid of those.
Yeah, super. Thank you, Jacob. The key I really took away is making sure you link all the different aspects that are core for the business. We need to think about developers, developer experience. There is the technical aspect that we need to consider, but most importantly is building that bridge to what is the organizational goals and really mapping that, and then finding out for that context, what can we measure? Is it financial? Are these non-financial metrics? But making those visible and telling them as part of a story. And I think that was also really interesting that you said, sometimes you don't have all the information. So then you have to make assumptions and build hypotheses and make those explicit, tell your story, but you can provide a good reasoned argument that also with that story can take stakeholders along to invest in developer experience for their organization. Now, thinking about how we make this actionable, what would be a recommendation for someone starting their first journey with developer experience, thinking about bringing that into their organization? And then as a follow-up, what would be a pro tip for someone who's already in the midst of it, but where you say, hey, remember that one because that's one thing that really helped me to be successful?
Yeah. So for somebody to get started, just call me. I can help you. No, just kidding. But in terms of actionable, just starting to improve developer experience or going on the road, I mentioned user research a lot. Start talking to the devs. Get onto Software Factory 4. Start talking to people, observing them. You will hear a lot of things and opportunities. Again, think about influence and control. Don't ask about things you can't influence or control, or at least don't focus on them. This could help you deviate. Another thing that I would say is use the time to actually build a strategy. A strategy is a story that gets you from A to B. And on that road, there are obstacles. So figure out like, what is point B from a business, from a user perspective? What are the obstacles? How do I navigate around those? Really try to find those value creators for the developers. And taking the time to build a strategy. It's not something that you do in a day, or you sit down and write down an elevator pitch and then you're done for your technical platform. No, invest the time in that and do proper things, because also from that you will learn what you don't know, what your assumptions are that you want to do. And I think the most important thing that I want to highlight and to emphasize to get into developer experience is you don't need to build a large platform to improve developer experience. I mean, it's most of the things we talk about, and it's the most exciting things because they're large and probably quite influential and impactful. But sometimes it's really the small ideas that are like the hobbits in Lord of the Rings, like the small people, the small ideas that have a huge influence and impact on things and are quite easy to achieve. 2 examples for that. The smallest platform that you can build, or the smallest developer portal that you can build, is a wiki page, a Confluence page, where you curate the most important resources to find for developers. That's already a platform. From a definition of a platform, that's a developer platform. So you could start with that. And that's something everybody can do. And the second thing is just to point out a very small thing. On one engagement, we identified security as a huge blocker. Like, it takes a lot of time before you want to go live to get the security approval and so on, quite bureaucratic, paper-based and anything. And one thing that was really an issue is that the developers didn't have any means to test what they've been written in a concept and a paper and what the security department required of them for themselves. They all had to build it on their own. And it was a quite easy thing. There's like this, there's some security standards out there also with like open source tests that you can do. And the only thing that we did is like we took like one of those open source security tests that test more for the OWASP top 10 or 12. and put it into a container. We wrote an email to every developer team and said, if you put this container in your pipeline, and here's an example on how to put it in the pipeline, and the tests are green, you can be sure that this section of the security concept you already get a green mark and an approval for. So it was quite small, not a lot of effort. Building the product was quite small. It was more about building the service around the product, of distributing the product and kind of like checking people and making sure that the security managers also accept the test results and so on. Quite a small product, quite fast to do, very small idea. You can do that. It's already helpful. Small tools, small scripts, sometimes giving everybody access or making all repos public, already sometimes improving developer experience and sometimes the easy thing to do. And to think about a pro tip, and I will put out a pro tip that I would even maybe struggling with, but I think it's a good thing to do, is really investing in the analytics part. Right, really thinking about how do you track your user funnels? Like, how do you track how many people are on your platform? How large your user base is? What adoption rates are? Are they coming back? What are they using? If you really invest in that, and that's a pro tip, and I've done it in specific levels. I didn't fully flesh it out like you would have on an e-commerce platform, but it's so powerful. Because then as a product manager, you have data to drill into and try to see trends or get some insights on like, that's something we should look at. And you get the next idea for your roadmap. I think that's the pro tip. If you get to that level after user research and so on, that's the pro tip, which is also interesting. And if you figure out how to do it really well, hit me up. I will be really interested to hear about your story.
Wonderful. So many really good insights to make this actionable. And I love the small steps that people can take and already show success. Because especially when we try something new and introduce a new way of looking at a challenge, having that quick early success that can prove the value can really help accelerate that and drive also adoption for the approach and get more people in the organization to think about developer experience. So thank you for sharing that. As a final question, why is developer experience key for creating better products?
I think as we talked about, like technical products and platforms are not necessarily like the financial revenue thing, and we need to build better technical products to earn more money. And it's important this why to look at developer experience. It's more on a note of reducing wasted efforts and resources. So if you're building a technical product, and this could be a platform, this could be a container you're packaging, that could be a Wikipedia page that you're maintaining, even an open source project, you should think about what is the effort you are trying to save up, what you don't want to waste, right? Like if you look at developer experience, you don't waste efforts in any kind of like features that you implement and nobody's being used. And also it really helps to not follow the next trend and use the next technology, or just because the business wants to have scalability, you have a check mark against that. So it's really about checking assumptions, finding the risky ones, reducing the efforts to not invest in the wrong thing. And I think the other thing is you want to create better products because people love to use them and you don't want to force them to use them. And developer experience is for that domain the way for people to be delighted and loving your product, and not in the end burning your user base by forcing everybody to use it and then everybody quits, right? Would be the worst case. So developer experience is the key for building a better technical product that users love.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned some principles to me that made you successful in the context of developer experience. What are those principles that people who will apply the concept in their daily work, but what should they keep in mind?
Yeah. Brief summary, we talked about it. One of the things is be human-centric. Talk to the users, but do not neglect the business needs. Articulate the business value. That's one of the key things. The second thing I mentioned in the beginning, if people are not using your product or your platform, you're not generating any value. Value results from use. Keep that always in mind. If you are not on track on getting something in use, you're off track. And just to put a bonus one out there, which is a very personal principle I'm always following whatever I do, is show it when it's still embarrassing. Your prototype is not ready. We shouldn't do the hackathon because nobody will use it or we don't have enough APIs. No, do it. Is the storyline still embarrassing because you have not covered all the leaps of faith you're doing in there? No, start talking to your manager or to the CIO or whatever to get their opinion. It's so powerful to show an unpolished prototype or unpolished story that people then give you really honest feedback compared to you have a very fancy slide deck. So show it when it's still embarrassing.
Great tip. Thank you, Jacob. What are 3 books, resources, articles that you would recommend that have inspired you personally?
Yeah, I think the most important one regarding developer experience would be Team Topologies by Matthew Skelton and Emmanuel Pais. They're not writing about developer experience. They're writing about what team topologies are out there in terms of software development teams and how to structure organizations and so on. But in between the lines and the definition of what a platform team is and what key behaviors of the platform teams are, they make product thinking actionable. They make user centricity actionable. So those key behaviors in the book are quite helpful. And also they talk about some fracture planes on how to slice, or service heuristics, I think they're also calling them, how to slice services and platforms. And then we talk also about how to slice products pretty well. So you can pull a lot from that, and also it helps you to get into the domain of software development and how things should be working. The second book that I like to recommend, and has nothing to do with developer experience per se, but it's a book that is not very often recommended. I find the model and the content quite powerful, is Making Work Visible by Dominica de Grande. She came up with, I hope I'm right, with 5 time thieves. There are 5 time thieves that are stealing our time that you should always know and look out for. And she shows us ways how to get rid of those time thieves by making work visible in different kinds of ways. And maybe the connection to developer experiences here, like if you think about those time thieves that are in the book, maybe those are also time thieves for the developers, for your users that you might help with. And just for the fun of it, a fiction book. I love to read dystopian future settings. The one that I read recently, which is not that far away, and it was published before we had all the COVID crisis and pandemic, is Not Forgetting the Whale by John Ironmonger. It's quite the close future, and what I liked about it, usually the dystopian ones are really ending on a more negative, sad note, or at least there's like an aftertaste that goes in direction, but that one left me a little bit smiling and happy with a positive outlook for humanity. So I highly can recommend that book.
Thank you, Jacob. I love ending on a positive note. Thank you so much for sharing all your experience. It's been really inspiring to hear how you've tackled and different challenges and navigated people, organizations, and some of the constraints that are just naturally there when we try to build better products. So thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And if everybody's looking for me and wants to chat about developer experience, you can find me on LinkedIn and all the other social medias. Thank you.
And now a question to our listeners. What is your experience with creating a great developer experience? How have you been able to do this in your organization? And what were your successes and setbacks along the way? Please share your experience in the comments or reach out to me directly. I would love to hear from you and maybe have you as a guest on the show soon. And finally, if you loved what you heard today as much as I did, please share this episode with your network and give us a like in your favorite streaming platform. By doing this, you help to elevate the voice of our amazing guests. Thank you and see you next time.